And we're here. Wow. I can't believe a month has flown past and we're now in February. Isn't time flying? And last time we looked at airbrushes and spray paints. This time we're looking at brushes and sponges. Well, it's just an excuse to chat for 2 hours, isn't it? About modelling. I'm also going to show you my pitch video for my Kickstarter that goes live on Tuesday because I'm quite excited about that, and it's the thing I've been painting more than anything else recently. But wow, first up, I must say thank you to all my moderators, to Timber, Norm and Digger, who are all in chat this week. No emergencies calling them away. It's great to have them. If you say anything naughty, they'll probably delete it or tell you off, so just to warn you. And they're great with those chat bots. Getting rid of them, that is, not talking to them. And thank you for everyone else that's joined. I was starting to type out all the names and it just went whoosh with loads and loads of people joining, and I've no chance of keeping up, have I? But here we go. I'm not even going to try, actually. So we've got some new people I've definitely seen. We've even got a few dogs on there watching. Bracken's a dog, in case you were looking earlier up wondering who Bracken was. Not a cat, but a dog, who is blind and deaf, so probably one of my, not blind, sorry, deaf anyway. So definitely one of my better audience members, perhaps. And welcome, I can just see a few more people arriving. So welcome Adam and Stephen from Scotland, who's always with us. Adam, we met in a car park once. Nice to see you, Adam. And Stuart the Fish Whisperer, who's new, but apparently Digger got him along. So if there's any problems with him, we know to blame Digger. Right, so this week we are talking painting by hand. Probably should have called it hand painting, but I didn't want you to think it was all about just sitting there painting by hand and talking about the paints and stuff, though we will cover that. There's a little bit more about what you paint with from an implement point of view than the actual paints. I know we've been through paints in the past and talked a lot about them. I have my favourites, I have things I've tried, and I'll share them. So if you've got any questions at all about painting, feel free to pop them in chat. If you're new, say hello. I can see Dodgy Dioramas has just arrived. Hi Dodgy. And it's great to have so many people there because it gives me someone or something to talk to. I chatted to some friends earlier and they were like, how on earth do you talk for 2 hours? I'm like, well, there's a chat. It's not that I just talk randomly at a screen for 2 hours. I am mostly chatting with people on chat. So there we go. There'll be a few videos dotted through and, well, let's just see where it goes. But I feel a bit weird at the moment. I've got a Kickstarter going live on Tuesday. And my first Kickstarter, I probably started a week or two before I was ready. I was still doing snagging of prints at this point, and I hadn't done the stretch goals. I was only just doing the pitch video about now, and I was in absolute panic mode. And the day I went live, I was so stressed. It was unbelievable. And I'm not normally that stressed kind of person. I'm used to being in a stressful job, so I just let it go. Whew. The next one, which was Corix the Lava Moon, my second Kickstarter, a little bit better. I still didn't really get everything done as quickly as I wanted, but it was getting better. This one, well, I'm like ready, and it's Sunday, and I've got to do the instructions for stuff. I hate writing instructions. I actually put them off this afternoon and read a book instead. But, you know, I'm ready, and I was ready really on Friday. I did some stuff on Saturday. I'm like, what's wrong with me? It's not even Tuesday and I'm ready. I'm not panicked. I'm not feeling stressed about it. It's just like, wow. But what I would encourage you all to do, and I probably should have put the link at the top of the chat, is to go over and support my Kickstarter. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about chat and then we're going to show you the pitch video because I've just spent since October, November time creating all of this. It's all out my head. It's influenced by Star Wars heavily, Titanfall 2 and Starfield that I played a huge amount of. I got to level 100. I did all of the achievements. There's like 50 achievements or 100 achievements or something, 50 I think. And let's just put it this way, I probably put 250 plus hours into it. So there's a lot of hours in Starfield. Stop playing it now because it's Tomb Raider this week and I'll be playing Tomb Raider Remastered 1 to 3. The games that got me into video games was Tomb Raider 2, which we played at work one Christmas. So that's kind of where I've been up to recently. There's been painting, there's been actual modelling. I'm doing my B1 droid, my pit droid. I've got loads of exciting stuff, but I always get so excited by designing and creating that I never get around to doing the modelling. So anyway, I'm going to say hello to some chat people. Let's see. Elora, welcome. Nice to have you. If you're new to a live stream especially, welcome aboard. Grandpa Rails, I don't think I've said hello to you yet, but welcome. 43 out of 29. I'm not sure what code that means, but yeah. And who else we got? Matt Smith, hello. Nice to have you. And whoa, that's good. Everyone before that, I think I said hello to you in chat. I'm really sorry if I didn't. So I'm going to put on the pitch video. I have no idea if it has sound and whether it's going to be too loud, but here we go. No, I don't think it has sound. Interesting. So I'll just talk through it. There is actually sound on the pitch video. It's unlisted at the moment. It will go public on Tuesday when the Kickstarter does. So if there's no sound, because I can't see any sound on it, I'm actually going to go back and talk across it. So this is Severna Spaceport. The idea is I did a poll and Spaceport was winning until Space Station took over it, but I couldn't work out how to do a space station. So all of this is FDM terrain. Let me move me out the way. Oh, no. Oh, Kathy, that's very professional. That, ignore that. That was the one I wanted to move. Out the way, up there. There we go. And it's aimed at tabletop terrain for tabletop games. Why tabletop games? Well, because there's a really good market in it, and I really enjoy designing buildings and whole miniature worlds and scenes. It does mean that I'm not really doing the scenery I used to do, and I'm really missing it. I was looking at some bases I'd done for something and there was like grass on them. I was like, I miss doing grass. I miss doing all that stuff. But because I'm always painting and doing 3D print stuff at the moment, I've not really done any scenery. So I must get back to it. But anyway, back to selling this, because you know that's what I'm supposed to do. I split this up into 5 areas. We've got space traffic control, we've got the passenger terminal, we've got the cargo terminal, we've got fueling facilities, and we've got servicing facilities. And the idea is that you can print any of this. Every single item is modular, so you can print the walls, the uprights, the roofs separately, or it's a complete building if you just want to print and put it in place. But the complete buildings don't have interiors because they're just solid buildings. So that's a solid building, but the other one was modular. I've got things like cargo, and if you've seen the painting the spaceport video that was on recently, you'll have seen all of this already. And it's been really fun to do, actually. I do like painting stuff I've been designing for so long, but I'm still learning so much about managing time and what to put into these things. All the stretch goals are now done, but I probably won't paint them because the stretch goals, so that they kind of arrive. I've got them all printed. The last 1 or 2 are just printing off now on one of the printers. They should be off by tomorrow, and then they'll go into print testing. I've got some print testers who print things. And yeah, it's been a huge amount of fun to do this. I have to say though, I have a lot of thoughts about complete versus modular, and it takes twice as long in some ways. It's not quite, it's about 1 3/4 time as long to do a modular one than to do a complete one. And I kind of wonder whether it's worth it. But when I did a poll, the majority of people, like 2/3 of people, wanted modular and about half of people wanted complete. So it makes it quite hard. There's obviously a market for both out there. And I think it depends whether you want to play a game like Star Wars Legion, in which case complete building good, you just plunk it on the table, or whether you want to do a sort of RPG where you want an interior. Oh, and the Moonhopper Philip from Games Art provided, it's really nice, it's provided there so you can print it, but there's an add-on as well for 4 of his universal personal carriers, and I think they'll fit well with a wide range of universes because they're not specifically anything, they're Philip's own designs. Obviously he's been inspired by things like Star Wars and all the other games we play, but it's not quite the same. So this is my pitch video. As I said, it will go live on Tuesday, and we'll be able to actually get me doing the proper back now sort of speech. And you get a free gift if you sign up for the newsletter, my email newsletter, which if you're not on it, if you go to my website, there's actually a bit at the top of the menu for newsletter. And I don't write very often, partly because I'm not really a fan of marketing. It's like something I've got to do. But there we go. So that's it. That's the Varnish Spaceport. And I don't want to harp on about it, but it would be really good if one of you, Digger, Norm or Timber, could just pop the link in the chat for people. Otherwise, if I remember, I'll put it in the write-up afterwards. So there we go. Right. Norm says it's all really amazing. Thanks, Norm. You can always count on your moderators to be positive, can't you? Stuart ties his own flies for fishing. Good to know that, Stuart. That's really good. So there we go. And then, Elora says we've chatted in Legion Discord a few times. That's brilliant. That's really cool. And I must put up some of my pictures on there, actually, with it about to go live. Not that I'd advertise on there, because you're not allowed to advertise on most of the Discords, but it's always good to show off what I've been doing. And I put so much time into it, and it is very much perfect for Star Wars Legion. So there we go. Statings, waving. Hi, Stating. Flight Levels has arrived from Connecticut. Very nice. One of my favourite states. And then thumbs up from Grandpa for watching. So that's cool. Oh, that's your 49. Okay. So I think what he's saying is please go and like. There were 43 people and 29 earlier. So I have to remind you all to go and like if you haven't already, because it's apparently important on YouTube, and we all like to do what YouTube likes us to do. Norm says it's a wonderful world you've created. I love creating miniature worlds. Isn't that what we're all about? Isn't that what modelling is about? It's about creating a miniature world, whether it's sci-fi, a railway, whatever it is about creating that whole miniature feeling of capturing a feeling, capturing a location. Go for it, paintings arrived. Hello. And the people are saying, cool. Well, Stuart's saying it's cool. Timber's put up the Kickstarter. Thank you very much, Timber. I meant to do it earlier and just totally forgot. And if you go across from here to there, it will very happily show you kind of one picture. And that's about it, really. But you can sign up, and when it goes live, which is probably going to be 5 o'clock on Tuesday, it's up for about 3 weeks and a couple of days. So, it's around. And really do need, this is my full-time job now, doing Kickstarter, so I really do need people to back it. So I'm hoping it does well. Fingers crossed, please all go and have a look at it. But anyway, we are here to talk about painting, because that's what we're all excited about. And it's something we all have to do as modelers. So, yeah. Wow. Where should we start? Let's start with just a standard question that people have, and that is, what brushes do you use? I have to say I tend to use quite cheap brushes, and I buy them and I throw them away when they get bristled, except I don't like throwing stuff out, so actually I never throw them away. They just become weathering brushes or used for other stuff. And the one I did throw around, the brushes had actually, the bristles had actually curled completely round in a circle, and it was a really small one, and I thought, really, this just has to go. But I haven't been using it for paint. I'd actually been using that for mech pack and glues. Now I use Tamiya glues. They come with a brush in the bottle, so I haven't had to worry. So yeah. Quick look at chat. Dodgy Diorama says, yes, catching a story. That's cool. Oh, and Pat Goldblatt says, hello everyone, hello Kathy, great stuff, and loved to watch you paint it the other day. Thank you very much. I actually, it takes a good couple of weeks. I meant to paint it as I went along, I designed them, I've been designing them from November, test printing. I meant to do it in smaller batches, but I never do. I always end up doing the whole Kickstarter at the end. So there we go. We've got a whole chat going on about fish tying and fish whispering and what fish they're doing. So if the words like trout, salmon or pike don't make sense, that's what they're talking about. And Tim says, this is Tim, who is the current owner of Port de Norwich, well, current holdee of Port de Norwich, and does really great quarry modelling. He has quite a collection of cheap brushes that aren't much use for anything. Glad I'm not the only one. I feel like I should buy more expensive ones when I'm doing figures, but actually, I don't think I don't know, they just seem to lose their point so quickly. Elora says, I have a whole cup of old brushes like that. Some are probably 20 years old. Probably, yeah. I can imagine. If you're as bad as me, they probably will be. And then everyone else just saying hi. I'm going to put up just a movie, as they like to call it. And these are just pulled out of, and I'm using them really just to talk about brush painting as I go. Now, this brush here is a Daler-Rowney one, and it's got quite a long brush. And I wanted to talk a little bit about brushes to start with, because it's, this we're talking about brush and sponge painting. We'll see other things coming through. And one of the things that people do, let's see if I can get a really good picture. There we go. So one of the things people do when they want to paint small things, they use really small brushes. And that can be great if you're doing the eye, like you're doing a smaller black pupil or iris and pupil together, or you're doing something really small and detailed. But actually, they hold absolutely no paint. The paint will dry out more quickly, and it will take you a long time to paint anything. So with a miniature, if you have a brush like this, which is actually probably a little bit large for his leg crack there, but if you have a brush like that, you can get a lot more paint in it, so you can paint for longer with the same brush. So when it comes to brushes, it's really important that it's not the size of the brush that matters, it's how well the tip holds and how pointy the tip is and how fine the tip is. So when you go for more expensive brushes, and these are slightly more expensive, I'm still trashing them like anything, but they're slightly more expensive, they will hold their tip for longer, and you will get a really better result with a tip that is nice and sharp. The one thing that I probably don't do as well as I should, I end up with a lot of paint gunked up around the top of the bristles. And if you have a longer brush like this, you're more likely to have the paint down at the tip end and not get caught up around the top where they go into the brush. And that's what starts splaying the brush out when the paint builds up there. I use a brush cleaner when I clean my brushes. It's a soap in a little container. It's Old Masters or something brush cleaner. It's this beige tin I got off Amazon, and people recommend it. And it is really good to have a brush cleaner to help get some of the paint out, because even when you think it's clean, if you put a bit of soap on it, you can get a bit more out. But generally, I think most kind soaps would work for getting soap, to get the paint out of your brushes and to prevent that build up, which is what can cause problem with the tips. The other thing is to store them so that they aren't touched, they aren't bent, they are just, nice and able to sit properly and not get distorted. And you can leave them with a little bit of soap on them to keep them in the shape if you want to. Right. Oh, we got more stuff in chat. So, Stuart does all trout species. I haven't done sallock fishing, and I have had a kelt on a fly, but I have caught a pike on a dry fly for trout. We'll move on from that. That is just something beyond me. And I think Adam's right when he says there's something fishy going on here. Perhaps the water modelling for fish lakes should be the next live stream topic. Perhaps, but I did plan to do some stuff on water modelling, but I just haven't really got around to it. Jaw21 says, aren't they called rigger brushes? Yeah. I think this one was called a liner, which is what Tamsin calls it, rather than a rigger. But I also just go by the numbers. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this brush for everything, but it's more that it's quite an extreme one to show an example. And actually, I rarely use one as long as this. I probably use one about half that length normally. But it's an example of how you can hold more paint. So, Secret Anorak has a question. Is it really worth buying top-end expensive brushes? I use middle-of-the-road brushes and wonder if they're worth the extra expense. So I've never bought a top-end brush. I don't own a sable brush that I'm aware of. And these Daler-Rowney ones, which I think I buy in packs of 3, they're not that expensive. And I would say that these ones are actually slightly better than the cheap ones, that they might last slightly longer, but you might be able to buy 5 cheap ones for the price of, say, one of these. And it depends what you're painting. For miniatures, I think the more money you spend on a brush like this level, the better the quality will get. And then people who have the top end, say, you'll notice a huge increase in quality. When you move to them, you'll get better tips, you'll get better paint. I haven't ever tried it to know, because like many people here, I'm probably too cheap to pay 20 quid for one brush, put it in the pile, then lose it. So I tend to have these Daler Rowney level as my top level. I have bought all sorts of makes. I had a load of AK Interactive ones. I had one which had a shredded top for weathering. So I have bought loads and loads of different makes. I like the Daler Rowney because I can pop down to my local Hobbycraft and they've got them there and I can just buy them. And I can see them and make sure they're the right size when I buy them. So, yeah. Timbersurf says professional sign writers use very long brushes, and that I think is because they want to hold a lot of paint so they can do the entire swirl in one go. That's a very good point. SJ Tringwell, hi, evening. That must be Simon, as everyone's saying hello, Simon. Digger says I have many brushes, none of them are expensive or very expensive. I think that's probably quite true. Most people don't. So Tamsin says, and Tamsin does some great work, my go-to brush for most mini painting is a Winsor & Newton Series 7 size 1 with an occasional fine details done with a size 0. I often have a 2, I think, and a 0. But yeah, my really, really fine one is like minuscule. It's like a little spotter. It will do half a spot of paint practically. But yeah. Stuart says, I have only watched Bob Ross paint but never seen Molesby painted. Well, let's click play and you'll be able to see some more being done. And Polymuth says, oh, interesting topic. I try and please. If anyone has any topics that you want me to do in future, by the way, just pop them in chat, because Thunderbirds is definitely not a go at the moment. It's still on my side. I'm still really busy and I've got 3 other projects I'm going to clear through first at this rate. So yeah. And Polymuth says, and welcome, says, been meaning to get a dedicated brush for my 1/12 scale figures instead of using a kid's art brush. You will notice a step up from a kid's art brush if you go for something with a finer point. Timber says, and Timber also has great advice, if paint goes up the barrel, it's very hard to get out. You end up folding the bristles to agitate it out. Using longer brushes makes sense, as you don't get paint up to the barrel, just on the tip. Excellent. That's really, really true. Hi Thorn, welcome. And right, I'm going to click play because it now looks like I moved on from doing these acrylics, which you can see was really not working. I moved down a brush size and instead I used an enamel wash. So this is the brush that comes with the Tamiya enamel wash. I love the fact that Tamiya enamel washes will flow into gaps. I just love them, and they come with their own brush. So this is a really great use case for buying something specialist as opposed to making your own. And these are called panel liners. I do really love them. I use them a lot. I've got them in about 6 different colours and I wish they did more. But I think there's about 3 greys I've got. We've got grey, dark grey, pale grey, black and brown. And they work really well. And then once you've put an enamel wash on, you let them dry, and then you just use a this is a cotton bud. So you can see it's not always about a brush. Use a cotton bud or a mini brush to go over them. Maybe a couple of hours after you put them on, and then they come out of all of the sort of faces but stay in the gaps, because these are thicker and they won't go into the gaps. It's you know, these are just a series of paints I did. And again, you can see I'm using this really long brush, and this was to put extra black into these cracks. Clones, these are clones, they're white, so I primed them white. And doing these black bits is actually the worst bit of the whole lot, because you've got to get into all these narrow gaps. A lot of people use contrast paint, which is or speed paint, which is what I use, which is something that flows more easily. The trick is you want them to flow. But we're talking brushes today, and for all of these washes, you can see this is one of my old AK Interactive brushes. So this is a brush that was probably a neat brush, but the tip has splayed out a bit, and now I use it to put washes on. So I've moved from my fine stuff that was on before to doing a wash with a thicker, older brush. And that is basically, you know, you pick the brush for the job. Now, this, you know, I'm dipping into this wash quite frequently. Oops, gosh. Just pause that there. This is not a great brush. Oops. You can see that this is definitely not a great brush. But actually 90% of the, wow, there we go. 90% of the brushing that I do, the painting that I do, the brush is almost not important. If I look at the spaceport I just painted, I didn't use any good brushes on it at all. In fact, I used quite big brushes because I was trying to do big details. And sometimes, you'll notice this when you see my painting the spaceport, to get a nice fine edge, you want something with quite a lot of paint you can flow across. So where I was painting, say, a square, and I was painting the top half one colour and the bottom half another, and there's a line across the middle, actually having a bigger brush means you can just wipe across that middle in one go. And you can see the edge of the brush. The brush size itself is almost irrelevant because you are just dragging across a line. So really, you can use quite poor brushes for those, but once they splay too much, it's worth getting a new one. Right, questions. Polymuth, mainly to paint fine lines, would you have a recommendation? I do like either this Winsor & Newton Daler Rowney type of level, that is, those are UK ones, but you're sure you get them in the US. And I would say to paint fine lines, I use a 1 or a 2, maybe a 00, and just go and have a look in an art shop if you can. Something with a longish, longish barrel is good, and then a very fine tip. And you can find that you can get, I was chatting to an artist who'd done O scale, and someone said to him, do you use fine brushes? And he says, you would be horrified if you saw the size of the brushes I use. Because all his brushes were really chubby, so they could keep a lot of paint, but they had hugely fine tips, so he could get the detail when he wanted it. So I just say, get a paintbrush, and for those fine lines, choose a fine one, but don't go too small. Secret Anorak has another great question. Is it worth getting a wet palette to use with your brushes? I would say yes. I made my first wet palette, and you might see it. It was actually probably the one at the start of this video. I made it from an old cheap Hornby weathering sort of plastic container that I bought. I took all the weathering powders out. They were like eyeshadow. One of them I swear was even pink. And but it was a cheap kit. And I put it in there, and I used some of that sponge you get for the kitchen, a thin sponge, it's Spontex sponge, which is a bit ridged. And then I put baking paper over the top, not greaseproof, but baking paper, and cut it to size and put it over it. And I did that for a good 2-3 years, and it was fine. And then I got an army painter one, and the sponge is like something my mum used to have for her face from a very expensive Japanese makeup company, Shiseido or somewhere. And it's really fine, and it holds the water in a slightly better way. And then they've got something on top that isn't brown like baking paper, but is a similar type of function. It's a bit finer, and I do think it's marginally better. And the army painter one is not expensive. You don't need a big one. Mine's about this big, so you don't need a big one. But yes, it's good if you're doing a project that's going to take a while, because your paints don't dry out as quickly. They will eventually dry out, but not as quickly. And so you can keep a project going for longer. And if you're painting a mini, it means you can mix a custom colour and use it for the whole mini, and it's not going to be off. Whereas if you put it on, say, a business card, which is the other thing I use, it's gone as soon as it's dried. You can't use it. But I would only recommend it if you're painting like figures, small things with it. Once I go up from that small thing, I tend to make containers of paint, mix up as much paint as I need for a project, and then slap it on, because I'm doing a lot of slapping on at the moment. So let's see what else is in chat. David Orff says, for really fine work, I always buy Kolinsky Sable brushes, which are not the most expensive, but do hold their tips better and are easier to clean for size 0 or smaller. And those are the ones I've heard of as being the more expensive ones. So Polymuth is just trying to add helmet details that the toys don't have out of the factory. If you're painting fine lines, then maybe a 00 or O would probably work. But try and get one with a longer brush, not a really short brush, because you won't have any paint then. And the other thing is to consider using the enamels I was using, because they will flow into cracks. And when I've painted toys, quite often I've kept the self-coloured plastic, I've put on the panel lining, and then I've sprayed them with a matte varnish to get rid of the plastic look. And by the time you've weathered it, it really doesn't look like painted plastic. I've got a Halo one over there that I did that to, Master Chief, and I actually did a whole, very old now, set of videos called Painting, I don't know, whatever, painting plastic, no paint weathering or something for, you know, plastics. And I find that enamels or oil washes that sit in the cracks actually brings out the details really well on toys, because they're a shinier plastic, so it runs really well and it just looks so good. So there we go. So greetings from colourful Colorado, USA. Hi John, nice to have you with us. Stuart the Fish Whisperer, oops. I have a question please. What paint do you use, and do you use a resin to protect them once they are painted? Right, so I can tell you what I use to protect them in a second, because that's about to come up. But I use Vallejo mostly because I've had it for 20 years. I probably bought my first Vallejo. I also use Tamiya for certain colours. I like Tamiya Clear and Tamiya Gloss Black, because I don't think you can beat their Gloss Black for glossy black when you're hand painting. But they don't hand paint as well. But Vallejo, I also have Army Painter Speed Paints, which I'm trying to use more and more of because they're interesting to use. And speed paints, you just paint them on to something, and they're like a glaze, so the peaks stay the colour of whatever the undercoat is, which is normally white for me, and then they pool into the sort of cracks and crevices like a wash, and they're a more intense colour there. They annoy me in certain ways because I find the peaks are then too translucent. They just look weird. They look like thin paint. And then the shadows are too saturated because they've got more of the colour. But they're really great for a base coat, I find. So there we go. And let me just play this in answer to what do I use to protect them. And the answer is, we're just going to go through this bit again, that I would, for terrain, I don't always protect them. It depends whether I'm going to be playing with them or not. I haven't protected my Severna Spaceport, for example, and I probably should, but I'll take it outside at some point when it's not raining and do it, because I'm fed up of doing it inside. But this one, now I need to move me here again, don't I? This is, so you can see that writing, Mr. Killer Colour GX113 UV Cut Super Clear Flat. That is what I use to protect with an airbrush for anything finer inside, because spray cans just put out so much volume, and we talked about that last time. Yeah, that's just my choice. And the UV cut is great if you've had a 3D print and you want to stop the UV, if you're using the clear at all, but it stops yellowing as well and colour deterioration if there's any UV light around. So that's the one I tend to use, UV cut. And it's lacquer, so it stinks, so you shouldn't be using it without protection and stuff. Otherwise, I use spray cans and I use whatever I've got, but always a matte for final one. And yes, you always protect these paints. They will rub off when you touch them, which makes me think why I haven't done my spaceport ones yet. And I think it was just, I'd forgotten, because they were so many of them, I just hadn't got round to it. And there are some that are painted with a bit of a sheen as well, so I'd probably have to go back over that. But anyway, I would also say if you want a gloss finish, go with a satin rather than a gloss, because gloss just looks wrong on small models. Tom L says, what sort of brushes should be considered for smaller sails? Say N. Same size brushes. You don't actually want to go smaller on your brushes necessarily, because it's all about the tip. And if you go smaller, all that happens is that you can't hold any paint in the brush, so you're forever moving from the brush to the model to the brush to the model, and you're more likely to have the wrong amount of paint on, you know. So really, probably a similar size brush, because you use it for details in HO and N, you know, regardless. But probably just don't bother with the eyes. Really don't bother with the eyes in N. Tamsin, I'd suggest foam eyeshadow applicators rather than cotton buds for excess wash removal. No chance of leaving any lint on the model. That is a great suggestion. I can see what I'm buying from Amazon tomorrow. Ooh, yeah. Oh yeah, foam eyeshadow applicators. I obviously have some used ones somewhere. I'm sure I had some somewhere, but I'm not sure I know where they are at the moment. So yeah, but yeah, cotton bud does leave lint, which is why you should never use it for cleaning out, cotton buds for cleaning out your airbrush. Just to put that in there as a tip as well. So yeah, Tamsin, so Secret Anglerite says that he found the pointed cotton buds seem to be tighter on the stick and less likely to leave lint. I have to say the ones I have at the moment don't leave lint particularly. But one of the things, I have got some that are like a flat paddle and a point on the other end. You can get them there for eyeshadow application and stuff. And they can be useful. I just go through them quite quickly, and cotton buds are disposable. Single-use plastics. Whoops. Okay, right. David Orff says, good tip to Tamsin, not that I've ever used eyeshadow. You can buy them without the eyeshadow. You just buy the brushes. And Polymus noting it down. So whoever the black lil just is that doesn't seem to have anything. I remember Bob Ross using 4-inch house paint brushes on his paintings. Yeah, I probably wouldn't recommend a 4-inch house paint brush, but I do think a 1/2 inch or an inch chip brush is a really useful one to have for terrain. I certainly use that a lot on the bigger stuff. And certainly when you're doing a model railway and you're doing backdrops and things like that, you'll want bigger brushes as well. So Timberser says, if you go to model railway shows, ABC brushes sell brand brushes 20 for £10, so they can also be found online. So that's a tip if you want to have, you know, your brushes at a reasonable price. I have to confess, I've never watched Bob Ross. Stuart the Fish Whisperer says he was amazing. I've never watched him. So there we go. And actually, Tamsin, David, why haven't you used eyeshadow? Come on, you know, it's fun. Hi Reva70 from Australia. Nice to have you here. Right, let's have a look. First coffee and a pleasant surprise, 7:30 a.m. Wow. Yeah. Well, welcome to a hopefully good week, because it must be Monday for you. David Orr says, for bigger brushes, I tend to buy Proline, which are cheap. They're a synthetic fibre originally invented to use as suture material. Again, for acrylics, they clean well. I guess that's Proline. Yeah, I buy a lot of cheap art brushes when I'm going bigger stuff, because generally with the bigger stuff, I'm not trying to get fine details, I'm just slapping the paint on, so it's not really a problem. I got a pack from Hobbycraft of just cheap brushes, and it included a couple of very fine, but sized about 1/2 inch, 1 inch, like a normal paintbrush size. So they're good. Another Australian coming on board. There's Monique from Brisbane. Hi, Monsville Railways. And then Timber, note the genius idea of cardboard sandwich for the crock rods. Yes, now this is a Gunpla thing, and I probably should mention it. Now, I actually bought, you can get kits for the with a bamboo stick and a bit of insulated crocodile stick you just stick on. But these are for name places, so they're a metal rod with the clip more securely attached than just shoving a bamboo clip up its middle. And they're great when you're trying to put washes on or paint or do something like this. Now, I often put my minis on the bases to paint them. And it was a problem when I was trying to paint up Ahsoka's skirt because the base was in the way. But you don't want to handle them. And this is one way to spray paint them if you haven't yet put them on the base, which is not what I'd done here. So there we go. Too late. Oh dear. You're not late. Don't worry. Just getting here. So, Monsville, you and Reva can enjoy your morning coffee together. Starting rumours there. Oh, 6:40. I think you're a little bit away from him because he was 7:30. Tim Williams, Bob Ross's programmes are well worth watching. Very talented. I think some are on YouTube. I flipped past one the other day on normal TV, and I think my dad was up, so it was probably over Christmas or some time, and he was just like, why do people watch this? I don't know. We just kept flicking. So, Secret Anorak, Bob Ross is a smooth painter. He did it in the 70s, didn't he? There we go. So, let's see what else is on this. I put 3 videos on here. They're just excerpts from videos I remembered painting in. So, they're not Oh, no, I need to be selected on the video. There we go. Right. I would recommend, whatever you do, ooh, white base. So this is me still painting. That's my old wet palette, the one I handmade, and you can see there's a lot of black paint there. That was because I had a bit of a splurge. And now I'm just going over. Now this is the brush size I would normally paint with for something like this. It's a little bit small perhaps, but it holds enough paint, it's got a fine tip, and it works really well for just getting everything that you want. Now you can see, I'm just demonstrating the different paints here. I put the wash on, but then I cleaned up a bit with the white so that I got a different shape. I have no idea why I'm now bouncing that brush back and forth so much. And this is probably one of my go-to brushes sizes for something really small. You could go a little bit larger with a finer tip. And you can see I'm using exactly the same brush to do this fine detail here. This was Echo's hand. It was a nightmare to do. This will be Captain Rex by the look of it. Yeah, that's Captain Rex. If you haven't watched Clone Wars, really sorry, bit of a fan I am. And he has really complex markings that I did using this same size brush. So the answer is I would use this same size brush for almost everything. And you just want to make sure the tip is nice and sharp. You don't want to necessarily go to a smaller brush. So yeah, I mean, I did tally marks on his hands using the same size brush as I'm now using here. So it's not about the size 2-1, it's about the size of the tip, remember that. And some number 2s will be really blunt, they'll be squarish, some of them will come to a point. And make sure if you're buying them in shop, they've still got the little plastic protective sleeve on. You can store your brushes upright. I've got some of my stores upright and some of them in a little container to the side because I ran out of holes. So yeah, there we go. Oh, and people are bashing the like button. Thank you. I've got 64 viewers, it says, 62 viewers now, and 62 likes. So I think that's the most likes I've ever had. So I'm really proud of you all. Thank you. Norm, that's how Kathy gets so much done. She's a very fast painter. You should see me go. I suspect this is 8 times. You know, even painting on a live stream like this where I could, oh, time to stop that and put another, oh, no, I missed my stop. I wanted to show off that brush. So even when I'm, you know, painting for something like a live stream, I can't put it at real speed. You'll just never, ever get anything done. You know, 2 hours is nothing. All of my projects, some of them have had hundreds of hours of footage. Others have just, you know, just a few hours. I'm getting better at only recording what I need, so I haven't got as much. There we go. Rex, you're looking hot, mate. Right, I wanted to talk about this brush. Because we're now on to another part of painting and a different type of brush. Because let's face it, you do need more than one brush if you're doing anything. You need a selection, but you need to have the right brushes. Now I've since this video brought some proper dry brushes, and they are sort of shaped. Imagine this is the brush handle. And the shape of them is, I'm going to put that, you can see that. Anyway, it's there. It's kind of a dome like this. And it's very soft and fluffy dome. Really nice. I haven't actually used them in anger yet. I bought them, they're Army Painter ones. I haven't used them in anger. And you can get some really expensive dry brush brushes from Artis Opus and some of these other makes. And, you know, it's great. But for this, I'm using a bigger, finer, older brush. With just a more splayed tip. It's probably an old brush because I'm dry brushing. Now dry brushing, the idea is that you dry brush so the brush is dry. Did I say that enough times? So you wipe off all the paint on a kitchen towel. The trend now is that you have a dry brush palette, so rather than wiping the paint off onto a paper towel that can be drying to the paint, take the liquid but not the pigments, you put it onto a palette of rough stuff and just get it off all the edges. And then when there's no paint really left at all, you go over the object you're dry brushing and you put whatever colours on your brush onto it. It's normally a lighter colour because highlights are lighter. And it will catch just the highlights because it's a bigger brush and it won't go, and it's a nice big fluffy brush you want, and it won't go into the crevices, so you end up with light on top and dark in the crevices. And some people just can paint an entire model with dry brushing, depending what the model is, obviously. And they do, Artis Opus do some great videos showing you how they dry brush something, you know, whatever it is. And it looks amazing. And so it's another technique you should learn when you're brush painting, because it is really useful. And for these guns, some figure painters would highlight the guns by hand with a small fine brush and paint them. Personally, I think all I need on this is a dry brush. That's all I'm going to do. But it's a different type of brush. So yeah. And what does chat have to say? Let's have a look. Bob Ross is a smooth painter. Right, there we go. Where have we got to? So Reeve 70, yes, I'm a speed painter and I use a similar size brush for most of my finer work. Yeah, you'll find a lot of people use bigger brushes than you expect. And Reva says he uses airbrush for 85% of the rest. I don't love my airbrush a lot. I probably should use it more than I do. McCarrow Siding says, and this is why I don't buy them, I bought Artis Opus brush sets and they're expensive, so much so I'm afraid to use them. That's why I don't buy them, because I just would never dare use them. If I pay like 8 quid or 10 quid for a set, I'll go, yeah, I can use them, it's 10 quid, you know, that's fine. If I spend 30 quid on a set, I'm like, oh, I can't use these brushes, they're too expensive. So yeah, I get that, totally. Polybuth obviously is also a Rex fan because he loves Rex. There we go. Right, 40k painters always seem to end up dry brushing the paint onto the back of their hand. I occasionally do per stripes. What they're doing is quite often you see people with stripes on their hands and they're putting the paint off to make sure there's not too much on when they're just painting normal stuff. And I do that sometimes, but generally I just do it on the wet palette. But yeah, I've not dry brushed onto the back of my hand yet. But I'm using, I'm used to bigger stuff. Monique says, I use cheap, quite stiff brushes for dry brushing. Are the expensive brushes worth it? I just said earlier, I've never bought expensive brushes, so I can't really talk to it. So everyone who uses them does, but then is it like that thing where they spent all the money, so they're going to think that they're good because they've spent all the money? Is it just reassuringly expensive rather than worth it? I'm guessing they think it is. But when it comes, the Army Painter brushes, the ones I haven't used yet for dry brushing are not expensive. Army Painter isn't an expensive brand, so no. Stephen Cameron says the hardest part is knowing when to stop. Yes. I would just say that if your item that you have just dry brushed with pure white looks like birds have done messing all over it, then it's probably too far and you need to start again. There was a phase, and I was in model railways at the time, where people would dry brush with stark white, because like you see that everywhere in real life, don't you? The real white. And they would just go everything with white. And I'd be like, it looks like the seagulls have got diarrhea. And you can't say to people, oh, that looks awful. What on earth were you doing dry brushing white over a black roof? Because you never see white on a black roof. So I would say it's not just learning when to stop. It's also don't necessarily dry brush with white. Please don't dry brush with white ever, really, unless you're doing it clone and you're dry brushing the white highlights onto a white armour. You know, look at what you've got and go a little bit lighter, and then maybe go a little bit lighter again and see. But don't start with a really bright, different colour, because it will just show up too much. Timber says, I use a flat brush at a low angle to dry brush bricks, at 45-degree angle to the mortar so the bristles won't go down the cracks. It's a great thing. And flat brushes are really good for doing big flat surfaces like that. So that's great. I have dry brushed. I've actually just more painted bricks than dry brushed with a flat brush, and it does work well. Reva says, my dry brushes are my old brushes and I chisel paint off them with a scalpel. I'm not quite that bad. I do wash my old ones. Elora says, I bought some of the expensive brushes early into my painting. I tried to keep using it long after it was past its prime because I felt I should justify the cost. And maybe that is a problem. And also, I think as you get better, you probably don't damage your brushes as much. You learn to wash them a bit more. But some people just trash their brushes quickly and other people don't. I think it's about your painting style and, you know, loads of other sort of things go into it. But I've just never been able to justify it. But I am one to keep my brushes past when I should throw them out or down a level. So yeah. So Elora says, now I just buy cheap sets and blow through them as long as they last. I'll usually keep another on backup for when that happens. Yeah, I just keep spare brushes around, because if one starts to break and you start to get a bent bit on the tip, or the tip starts to curl and you're halfway through a really important amount of painting, then yeah, I just want to have a spare brush around for that. Tamsin, dry brushing on the back of my hand is to check how much paint is on. I would just dry brush on the paper towel to do that. Maybe that's what I'm doing differently. Reva 70, I've used $30 Australian brushes and I destroy them about the same time as cheaper brushes, so I went back to the cheap ones. I think that's a really good point. Know your own painting style. Don't start with the expensive ones, use the cheaper ones, and as you get more into it, if miniature painting becomes your hobby, then by all means upgrade. But if, like me, your miniature painting is not your main part of your hobby, it's something you have to do because you need them in your dioramas, then don't necessarily put all your money into that. Perhaps buy a different paint, with your extra money instead. But this is me dry brushing just a little bit, and you can see I'm dry brushing a dark grey. Not a white over my black guns. I think this is Kicks getting painted. Yeah, another tip is he's supposed to have a patchy paint job because it's weathered. Don't try and paint everything in one coat. Sometimes 2 thin coats is better. People online will always say to you, thin your paints, thin your paints, thin your paints. They'll even say it when you've thinned your paints if they don't know what else to say about your model. Yeah, thin your paints. I was doing a really fine logo with them then. And do 2 coats to get an even colouring. Unless you're like me here and you're trying to do a patchy weathered one. I'm going to go over it with weathering in a minute to hide the sins. Now for this, I wanted to bring something else up. This is an oil paint, and I'm going over all of these, just toning down the blue with some white over it to make it look faded. I do like doing that with oil paints. It's kind of a whitish grey. And the important thing to note is this brush, at one point I had blue brushes for water-based and yellow brushes for my oil paints, because I was using them both at about the same time. And so when I was cleaning them, I would know which one was more likely to have maybe a little bit of oil residue on it and which one was likely to have maybe a bit of water residue on it, So when I came back to do another coat really quickly, I wouldn't use one that had previously, we've gone on to the next video, had previously been used for oil paints on watercolour and then having problems with the brush. I don't know if that's a thing. I use it for my airbrushes too. I keep my acrylic airbrush separate from my lacquer airbrush. I'm pretty sure it doesn't actually make that much of a difference, but if you're doing a lot of paints of both, you could consider having different sets. So stating the obvious says, I used to go to Brighton Model World Show. The armoured vehicle models always seem to be dry brushed to death. Every panel, edge and bolt head was highlighted. Yep, and minis can be the same. Minis can have every single edge that there is highlighted. So yeah, it's a style. You either love it or you hate it. I'm not going to knock it. It's not my style. I know it's not my style because I started in model railways, and then you paint it and you light it. But there we go. Elora, expensive brushes aren't so bad if you are meticulous about brush care, but that's not my style. I'm sad to say I'm not as meticulous as I should be, but yeah. So Reva says he painted 23,000 points of 40k last year. I've barely painted my 800 of clones, and they're just black and white. 23,000 points. For those of you who don't know, points is the number of figures you have in an army, and each figure isn't 1 point. So he's not painted 23,000 figures, but he's painted 23,000 points worth. So a clone army that, one of the squads which may have 4 plus a 5th one, that might be like 60, 70 points. So you can see each figure's maybe about 10 to 20 points. Some of the Jedi that I paint would be worth 100 and something points. So, just to give people a lot of context. Especially if you're doing horde armies, you may have a lot of exactly the same thing. This is why I don't play Warhammer. You just spend all your time painting because they brought a new army out. So that, we spent an hour, we've looked at the pitch video, we've talked about brush painting. You will see me using brushes going forward in this. I'm not just stopping on brushes now. But okay, so it's 12 armies worth. says Viva. And armies can be quite big, you know, especially if you like me and you play clones and you field a lot of 10 activation. You know, I might put 50 figures out on a field. Probably I might put 50 figures out. Some people may only put 30, depending what they're playing. So we're going to talk about something else that is very dear to my heart nowadays, and that is Green Stuff World, who apparently nobody should buy from. I bought these years ago because they like to rip stuff off. I find it quite odd that people pick on Green Stuff World for ripping stuff off because, you know, Games Workshop brings out contrast paints. Every other paint manufacturer brings out their own version of them. And yet Green Stuff World are the ones that get told off for ripping off other people's stuff. I'm not quite sure at what point Army Painter, Vallejo, all of these people who've also brought out speed paints, contrast paints, express paints, whatever you want to call them, why they don't get the same ire. But anyway, people will no doubt tell me in chat what Green Stuff World have particularly done. But I think they're very good at nicking everybody else's good ideas and putting them into their range very quickly. But there we go. So this is my favourite one. It is a Green Stuff World weathering sponge. It's basically a plastic tube with a bit of sponge stuck up it. It's really, really my most favourite toy to play with when it comes to painting nowadays. And that's because I'm painting a lot of FDM. And FDM has layer lines. And I want to break up the eye of the layer lines. So in my head, if I put something splodgy on, like a sponge, I am putting on something that is breaking up those layer lines. It's disrupting the lines. Now, this is my Millennium Falcon. Actually, I must mention it. Ben has the updated version to this ship out on a Kickstarter at the moment. It's the Transport Delta. It's not a Kickstarter, it's a Frontier on My Mini Factory. So go to My Mini Factory, check out the Frontier for the Transport Delta. It's the 2400 because we're in the year 24. This is the 1700 version that he did in 2017. And we updated it a bit because it had supports and I didn't like some of the bits. So he updated it for me. And then he brought out an updated version because it was on my last Kickstarter as one of the add-ons. And he brought out a 2300 version for people. But he's actually got the 2400 version live at the moment. And if you want a really good playable spaceship, I did it at 125%. But it's beautiful. I love it. It's a great design. He's actually brought out a back without those engines on. So you can have the full, more like the Millennium Falcon back. Oh, I need to pause this. And you know, it just great. I had great fun. I mean, it printed, and I didn't do spray putty. This is literally just printed and painted, and it does show in certain lights that there are layer lines, but I really enjoyed doing this. So Curly Express says, I hope Digger was learning something from you. I hope so. He comes on here every week or every month. He says he is. So Reaver 70, yes, I love Green Stuff World's terrain stuff like rollers and leaf litter stamps. Yeah, I mean, they have the great stuff, even if they aren't supposed to buy from them anymore. Ross M says, I find that applying a subtle filter goes a long way towards alleviating the dry brush signature. And I'm guessing by that you mean over the top you put a thin glaze of a colour, more of a mid-tone colour perhaps, that just knocks the dry brush down a bit so you're not getting such a stark difference in paint between the top highlight you put on and the bottom or mid-tone that's already on there. And yeah, I certainly will always wash after my dry brushing. I will normally wash after my dry brushing to tone it down as well, because I wouldn't say it's a subtle filter, but I will just put a proper wash over it quite often. I don't tend to wash or dry brush FDM prints, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah. So there we go. And Stephen says, I once saw someone covering a model aircraft with a dart wash, then using a fiberglass brush to highlight the panel weathering. Very time consuming. I can imagine that was. And can I just say, it's a big figure painter thing to start with black and paint up. I have never saw the point of that. I've never ever understood why anybody starts with black and paints up, because you just have to use so much paint to get up to black. And then people sort of come into the middle now and they spray with black and then put white from above to give a zenithal highlight. And I'm just like, yeah, but you're baking the light in it. I don't paint in that way, and I always just put a primer on that's the normal colour and then paste my base colour and then work from there. So I don't do it the way figure painters do, but I watch people do scenery. Night Shift, Boil Eye Hobby Times, all these people, and they've obviously learnt it from figure painters, because what they do is they do everything. So they paint they put all the scenery on, all the static grasses in the different colours, all the soils, but I will always choose those to match the colour I want, and then I've got my finished scene. They then will go and paint it black and then paint everything again. And I just look at it and go, I cannot get my paint to look as good as the tones I can get from a decent, varied sort of soil scattery type stuff that I can do, building up natural materials and some of the other ones. So, yay, no. Just no, I can't understand it. Everyone's about to go on chat now and say why they do black. But yeah. So Ross M says, yes, exactly. Time consuming. So Reva70 says you can do an acetone dip for FDM prints to reduce layer lines. Not really, would be my view on that. You have to do it for ABS. And I don't like printing ABS because it has fumes and I find it warps like anything. So I print PLA, and acetone doesn't affect PLA. So these prints that I'm doing, you absolutely cannot use acetone on them. But I tried acetone on FDM and I did the vapor and nothing really happened. It just went a bit tacky. And I had a full vapor in there. I did it the way you're supposed to. I painted the acetone onto my ABS. This is when I had an experiment of doing ABS. And, well, it just went tacky. It went smooth, but it also went patchy. And it wasn't very good because you've obviously painted it on. But and one of the things they say is you do that, it rounds out all the sharps because it basically melts the plastic. So I don't think people that do acetone dip for FDM prints are actually doing these kind of sharp details. Because if you did acetone on this Transport Delta, blurry as it is, those sharp lines there would start to become soft. Anything sharp gets softened. So I don't really think it's an answer. And I see a lot of people say, can you not do that? And the answer is not if you're printing PLA. And I would advise, unless you're doing something specialist, you print PLA because it is the easiest thing to print. And there's much more out there about printing PLA than there is about ABS. But for me, ABS was an unmitigated disaster. So I just haven't touched it since because it just didn't work. So I would say probably acetone dip is not worked for me. Now it may work for you, Reva, and that's brilliant if it does, but dipping something this size in acetone, just wouldn't want to do it. So Monsville says, yeah, dry brushing FDM prints highlights the print lines. It can do on resin prints as well. You do have to be careful. So I do dry brush FDM prints, I'm lying, but I dry brush the edges. So when I did the Epsilon Bomber, I dry brushed the edges and I didn't dry brush any of the flat surfaces with the lines on. Yeah. So Reva says the timing is the art to dipping those, so don't do your good ones first. Yeah, I guess you must print in ABS because PLA just doesn't get impacted by it at all. So yeah, but more for terrain. Yeah, I wouldn't like to do anything with a sharp line on it, and I just found it didn't work for me. I tried it, and I don't know whether certain brands of ABS have got other mixes in there that just make them not as easy, but the brand I had, even when I put the filament in a bath of acetone, it didn't really soften. So obviously my brand of ABS, it just wasn't, it was more acetone resistant. So yeah. Hi Richard, SGRO, nice to have you here from France. Yeah, it looks French. Is that blue? Yeah, green for a second. Bonjour. So other brushes, because we're talking brushes and sponges, and we're now firmly onto sponges. You saw my first sponge and you'll see it again in a minute because we've got another video with a lot of sponging. And I really do love sponging. But one other brush that I find really useful for sponging are these foam disposable brushes. They're flat, so I used them on my most recent video that was out on Friday. I use them for catching highlights on raised areas because they're flat. But they don't put things on it evenly, so you can get a bit of a worn technique. And it was really useful for doing these edges and catching these edges to make them look worn, because it's got a real straight edge. So you can just put it on there and just catch the edges. Find them so useful for that because they've got a sharp point and they're just foam disposable brushes. But trying to catch that with a brush, bearing in mind I haven't done anything on these layer lines, so they are very visible in certain lights. You know, it wouldn't have worked to dry brush. And actually, when you see me putting that wash over there, you see I dab it off. It's just to fade the blue because it was looking a bit too blue. You really can see when you put it on that it starts to show up the layer line straight away. And if you let anything like a wash pool, you will definitely get layer lines showing up. So it's important when you do these things that you think very much about the surface that you're painting. I would, for FDM prints such as this, you can use washes, you absolutely can. You can see me showing off the brushes I use here, a nice big flat one. And this is, these are artist acrylics, and I'm using a bit of matte medium with them to make them more translucent. And I'm painting them on with the brushes to try and get just a bit of colour on here. And then I'm streaking them with the bigger brush. And this is where, you know, thin brush to apply, bigger brush to streak down, and then dry off that bigger brush so it doesn't pick up too much paint. And it's a really good way of doing streaking with acrylic brushes rather than enamels, because enamels do sit down a bit more into the layer lines. And you can certainly see the layer lines are very visible here in places. And I really didn't want anything that would sit into the layer lines specifically for this. So the underneath is very orangey yellow. This is a very old battered ship. You can really see the layer lines there. They're just so obvious. And I just didn't want to have to sand that off. The fine detail would be lost, I felt, if I did that. And it's most visible on areas like that where there's a lot of layers, not that, I think I did this at 0.2, and you're just never going to work on a curve. Curves really show up your layers more than anything else. So Reva says, love a good wedge sponge to get the aircraft wing weathering engine smears down the fuselage. Yeah, you need to find a sponge that works for you. The foam brushes are what I use for wedges. I have some wedges, I have makeup sponges, I have natural sponges, you know, there's loads there. And the same brush, the same big brush, but now dry, I'm using to put pigments on. You want a big floofy brush for pigments because generally you're using pigments to apply specific weathering like this. I need a big floofy brush to kind of floof it around in a nice, I realised I was doing that the wrong way. It needed to fly the other way. But you want them to go on as a nice powder for weathering. You need to put them on with something like a blusher brush, which has got a big sort of end, something like that to put them on. If you want to do a small smear or something, you obviously want a smaller brush. But pigments, these are going on to, I think I washed them off. This has got a matte coat on it, so it will be sticking to it. And then I had to seal these, but they're black, so they sealed all right. So you see here, I'm just going over everything with pigments to try and just dirty it down a bit. Rather than using a wash that would sit in the layer lines, the pigments sit in a different way. They sort of coat it a bit more evenly. But again, a bigger brush. So it's definitely good to have a good 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch brush around if you're doing large areas of anything. So yeah. There we go. I think this ended up a bit more yellow than I meant it to, if I'm honest. But there we go. Floof is a specialist term not found in the Oxford Dictionary. Are you sure it's not in the Oxford Dictionary, Timber? I am pretty sure floof is in the Oxford Dictionary. Anyway, and once I move on to doing terrain, and I count this as almost terrain size. It is a terrain, really. I am definitely using bigger brushes just for speed. If you use a small brush, you'll spend longer doing things. And the other thing is, quite often, I sometimes look at things and go, I'll just hand paint this. And this is what I started doing. I started hand painting these. And then I'd realised that actually I painted them black, but that's what I wanted for the floors. All the walls needed to be in a colour. And actually, me now spending goodness knows how long hand painting, because I didn't want to have to mask off the floors on a couple of pieces, was really going to take much longer than me just going round and masking it and airbrushing it. So just think carefully about whether you actually, what the right thing is. Is it quicker to mask and paint, or is it, this is a failed brown wash experiment by the way, is it quicker or is it quicker to hand paint? Sometimes I do hand painting just because I find it easier, when actually it would be quicker for me to do a brush paint, airbrush paint. You know, you have to really think about it. So this then, because of the layer lines, this wasn't the best technique, but I did it anyway. And this is the technique that I use on 90% of my FDM prints. And it's to use a thicker paint that is less likely to pool, and then to drag it off with the paper towel. Now, this is probably a bit too thick. I think I thinned it down after this a little bit more. And it's just piling it on and then wiping it off. And this is how I did my Saverna spaceport. It's basically how I do 90% of my painting now, where I want to weather something and it's an FDM print. Because it's thicker, it sits in, you can drag it off, drag it out of the layer lines. Not totally successfully on this Transport Delta, to be honest. You really will see the layer lines highlighted by this in the sort of panel areas, some of them. I think one of my painters was having a bit of fit at the time, and it isn't as good as it could be. But it just somehow doesn't seem to show up as much as when I put a wash on and everything is just set to pool. So this is just a gunky brownie whatever to make sure everything is weathered, because I don't think the Millennium Falcon was ever pristine when, look how many towels I used, when Han Solo had it. Certainly when Lando had it, it was. And you can see what a difference it makes, but also you can see the layer lines have now been brought out on some of those panelled areas. But you know, terrain is for tabletops, and so maybe it doesn't matter as much. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about markers. I've talked about brush and sponge, and we've got another video after this that is, these are contrast paints by the way. I'm putting on a yellow to yellow out these things just to add some highlights and colour into this. I still need to do the details for this. But one of the things that I do when it comes to panels, and I did a whole video using them practically, is to use markers, Gundam markers or gel pens or whatever it is. They can be a really useful way if you want to put a fine line on. Monochrome pens is a classic example of something, a metallic, that if you want a small dot, it's the best way to put a small metallic dot on. So quite often I will use markers for fine details rather than paintbrush. These are them. They tend to stand up on the higher points easier. They're a firmer tip. It's kind of a paint. These are gel pens. So it can be, you know, you don't always need a brush or a sponge. Sometimes a pen is the most appropriate. And ironically, we are actually used to doing pens. This is a bronze Sharpie, I think, going on to, this is my first Kickstarter, the modular landing pad. And for doing this, and for doing these wires, actually the pen was one of the easiest things. So, let's look at chat. Another use for a sponge brush, just applying a wash. It had to be wiped off. You see how that wash is just sitting in those layer lines? Wipe it off and you get it in the cracks and crevices, but it doesn't sit in the layer lines in the same way. So you can wipe it off the areas you don't want it to sit in the layer lines. But otherwise, that would just literally have drawn out all of the layer lines. I think this is an isopropyl alcohol wash, looking at it. But yeah, you just need to be careful you don't pull it out of the bits in the gaps. You want to make sure it's not, you've not pulled anything out that you need to stay dark. Right. Oh, they're talking floofing. Stuart is back. Oh, I don't think you missed much. And the good news is you can always watch it later on YouTube if you're that exciting. So because these are quite fine and I was struggling to get this in, I went back to the pen. Remember, if you've got panel lines, you can always just use a pen to mark them. But here we go, just loads and loads of painting. This is a Bespin inspired landing pad. This was a nightmare actually, because I was using an isopropyl alcohol wash and it reacted with the paint and started to bring it off. So this doesn't look that good, and I probably will go over it again with another coat because it was just starting to look really weird, but it did for the Kickstarter. He kept me running while I was away. Ooh, I could do with the exercise. Right, weathering. Another way to deal with layer lines is to is to go over them with heavy weathering. This is my technique normally. Weather everything a huge amount and do it with quite a brush that the way you do the brushing doesn't draw out the layer line. So not a dry brush, make sure there's more paint on your brush than a dry brush, and paint them so that the layer lines are broken up by the streaks that you have, and it will hide quite a lot more. So this is heavily weathered because I like a smooth sci-fi finish, and somehow I just can't get it with FDM prints without sanding that I'm not really keen to do. Right, Timber says, I stand corrected to what? Floof. Oh, I don't know. I'm just guessing. Let's see. Is it floofy or floofy? Oh, I don't know. I would have gone with a Y myself. That's a good question. Norm is asking, is it floofy with a Y or floofy with an IE? Yeah, I'd have gone with a Y. So again, more sponge painting. One trick with weathering, especially if you're trying to mask things, is use multiple colours. Drag at least 2 or 3 colours over so that you're getting more and more colours. If you were to look at my Coryx the Lava Moon where I painted that, huge amount of sponging on that one. Huge sponging. I sponged in brown, a dark brown. I sponged in a light grey over the top. And the more layers that you can sponge, just the far better it gets, because you'll get a much better sort of realism. Because when I look around weathered buildings, they aren't, oh, I am white and I am weathered in one exact colour. There are tones within that you can use. So you need to make sure if you weather, you do weather with at least 2 or 3 different colours. And for Coryx, I used a dark brown and a light grey. And having the dark brown down first, I loved it. I loved the effect on that particular one. And again, you can't, this is another enamel, Tamiya enamel panel liner. You can't knock the fact that they've got the brushes in them. Okay, Reva70, my watercolour artist partner put me onto the soft rubbery silicone wedge as an eraser for wet work. That's interesting. I do have 1 or 2 of them, and I've never ever really used them, if I'm honest. I'm never quite sure where to use them. You know, I used them actually when I was doing some modelling with sort of epoxy clay. It was a epoxy sculpt, I think, because they don't stick as much to it. But yeah. Oh, Secret Anorak's voting for floofy with a double E. Oh, Stuart's now come floofy. Is that the plural? Floofy. Timbersurf, transitive, informal, often humorous to make something fluffy to fluff up, quotations intransitive, informal to move in a floofy or fluffy manner. There we go. It is in the dictionary. Ah, good. The things we learn, as Timber says, the things we learn. Floofing. Floofing heck. Oh, I'm not sure I can say that. There we go. So that was the video. And that was just showing off some of the sponging. Right, so let's just go down the chat for a second. We've got loads of people laughing. Adam laughing a lot. Stuart the Fish Whisperer. Sorry, I went completely Scottish on that one. It's floofles. Yep, I can see floofy or floofles as a pet name for somebody. Though I call my sister Pumpkin, just to be clear. Far too many people in chat seem to know about fluffing. Do you not floof your cushions, you know, when you plump them up? That is a beautiful model. Thanks, Norm. I'm not quite sure which one you meant, but they were all beautiful. Can't beat a good fluffer, says Secret Anorak. And my fly too, I deal with a lot of fluffing. Dabbing rather than brushing. Ah, yeah, for sponges. I think it depends, because the last one that I did, which was streaking with the sponge, was about doing streaks. I use that big sponge to give a very nice streak effect. But I do like it if you're doing big panels to use those big sponge brushes, because you can get some really good. So there we go. So Digger, the effects with that sponge brush are really good. Thanks, Digger. And Timber, I never convinced sponge brushes had a use. Now I know. So there we go. You can actually use sponge brushes. Those are the disposable foam ones. Do not be fooled by the word disposable in them. I wash mine and reuse mine because, quite frankly, disposable seems a bit of a waste when you can wash them. And you can wash them and reuse them many times. So there we go. Thanks, Adam. He says they look amazing. Loads of hearts. Me too, Timbers. The weathering looks great, says Digger. Reaver70, yeah, when I do armies worth of 40k basing, I airbrush with 3 colours. It actually takes no time and it always looks great. It is true. It is quicker to airbrush and mask sometimes. It depends what you're doing. And actually, I can see a question from Jaw21, bit off topic, but do you use latex masking fluid? I do, sometimes. I used it recently on my Titanfall helmet where it had 2 little inserts in the ears that had a slot in them. And I was painting them metallic. So I put the latex into that slot and then I could paint them with the metallic paint using an airbrush and then get that out. I did an Iron Man, which I've never finished. One of those shelf queens. And I've got as far as putting the latex on for the first colour, spray painting that, and then I don't think I've got as far as putting it on for the second colour, which is like gold, I think. So yeah, I do. But it's not good for big areas, so I only ever use it for small areas. For big areas, I find it is too uneven. I'd rather use masking tape. So Timbersurf says fluffing and floofing are different verbs. Timber's now our expert. He's actually looked it up in a dictionary, unlike the rest of us. Tamsy says fluffing is a specific term from the adult entertainment industry. Well, we went there. I thought when you fluffed your lines, it just meant that you got your lines wrong. But now I'm wondering whether I should be saying, oh, I fluffed that. I daren't Google it. You just daren't, do you? Now she said it, I'm like, I'm not Googling that. I'm not Googling to see what it says. We won't ask how Tamsin knows. She's probably Googled it. Anyway, Secret Anorak says he uses latex to simulate paint peel. I was not going there. Yeah, I've used it quite a bit on sort of edges of things. I see a lot of cosplayers use it for wear on sort of big things. I've used it on wood when I was doing wood panelling. So if you can imagine a clapboard side of a building, and you can buy them, which the laser cut ones. If you want to differentiate, because the laser cuts don't actually have the twist that you should have, or if you've done your own, which I have done as well, you can just catch the edge of the board with a little bit of the latex. And then when you spray paint it, you have to spray paint it really for it to work. When you peel it off, the edges of the boards are all caught, which is far more convincing than anything else, because that's where the paint peels, and then you've got the real wood underneath that's coming through. So yeah, it's a really great technique. Secret's right to point it out. Digger says don't Google it. Yeah, folks, don't Google it. Hi, Chobberton Junction, nice to have you here. Freudian slip. It was a bit, wasn't it? I've been reading too much. Oh yeah, I'm not sure Tamsin's been busted really. She probably just Googled it by mistake, Adam. Stating Mum, Tamsin's being rude. I don't know, Tamsin, you're getting some stick there. Freudian error there from me. Yeah, definitely, says Timber. Tamsin says, lol, I used to know a few people in the industry back in the day. Well, that's more than I can say, so I'm glad that Tamsin's come clean. This is obviously a confessional for everybody. So there we go. Right, so I've talked a lot about sort of brush painting and sponge painting. I'm just going to run through a couple of other things you can use to paint and the successes or not that I've had with them. One of my biggest problems I have is painting huge flat areas. you want to paint a few flat area and you want to use a sponge to put some kind of pattern on it. And those weathering sponges produce a square mark if you try and do a big area. And I have used them on the tops of the train buildings, but it's not been ideal. I have tried sponging with normal sponges, and I've never actually been happy sponging a large flat area. I just find somehow it doesn't work for me. I'm obviously haven't got the technique down. I don't know if my paint's too wet, I think it's that my paint's been too wet in the past, and so I'm putting too much paint on. And one of the tricks of a sponge brush when you're dabbing is not to have too much paint on it. If you have too much paint, you don't get the sponge. What you get is just a blob the shape of that. So you want to be dabbing out your sponge on a surface, and I actually do it on a plastic lid of the container normally. So I'm not getting rid of any liquid, but I'm just dabbing it out so there's less of it. And so there's something here about you definitely need to have the right amount of paint on your brush or sponge. And I've never quite managed it for a big area. I've tried it with bigger sponges and somehow I never quite get the mix right. And I suspect I'm putting too much paint on, and I should build it up with a colour that's closer to the road surface area, which is what I was trying to do, and sponge it. But the last time I did a how to paint roads, the first 2 attempts went in the bin because I just wasn't happy with them, which goes to show how much I've struggled. And I'm sharing this because I think sometimes we sit here and I say, this is how I do this, this is how I do that, this is how I do this. And it becomes really easy for people to go, oh, you're really good at this. And I want to say, I've never managed to sponge a road to look good. All my attempts have gone in the bin. So sometimes, I don't know, is sponging just the wrong technique to do a road? You'd think to get the asphalt tarmac surface, that actually the texture you can put on with a sponge is really good. And I think part of it is I've been trying to build that texture up with a sponge, which requires more paint to get the texture. And then when I then look at it, it's too blobby. So yeah, so there we go. That's my confession about sponging large areas. I really struggle at them. I noticed that when Luke Towan does it, he does something spattery with his airbrush, which I've never tried. But, for him, he goes over with the spattery. I have done really well with spray paints that have a spatter in them. You have to get the right ones, because the ones, if you're not careful, you get ones that have got a spatter like you see on the side of some of those toilets. I don't know if this is just a British thing, but you'd sometimes go into a toilet and it looked like someone had just sprayed splobs of paint everywhere, really fine splobs of paint everywhere, which I think is probably what they did. They probably put it in a drill with a sponge in it, ducked and went, I'm sure they had something more technical than that to put it on. But it kind of, but you can get some with a much finer, like a texture, like a stone texture, and it will produce something that works really well. And that's generally where I go with roads now, is using that. But I've struggled immensely with trying to paint huge flat areas using sponges. But they are great for details, for edges, and for putting texture in. So Stephen says, I have the same view reusing disposable brushes as his wife Mary, the woman after her own heart, waste not, want not. Very true. Just because it says disposable doesn't mean it is. Adam, Confessions of a Cafe could be a new monthly live. Probably not. Definitely not. Timber, random pattern needs a ripped up sponge that has holes in cast sponges, or better yet, real sponge. I was actually using real sponge for this, and real sponges are blobby, but it wasn't a huge real sponge, so it did look a bit repetitive. Monique from Monsville Railway says, we all struggle, Kathy. Thank you. And Reba says, get an expensive natural sponge and you can rip it up for smaller ones, so you get odd shapes and odd grain rather than regular machine-made even sponges. Even with that, I think it's just, I think it's about the amount of paint as much as the sponge. And then Timber says, and keep rotating to the new side. Timber says, treat sponge like dry brushing and paint, remove on kitchen towel, then apply almost dry. And I think that's probably what I've been doing wrong. I think I've been putting too much paint on. Toilet splatter. Yes. I don't know if other countries have this toilet spatter paint. It's like in sort of government type public toilet sort of places. Let me know. Other people know what I'm talking about. It isn't just me. Please, someone tell me they know what I mean about toilet spatter paint. And Monique says, it's good to hear we're not alone with our struggles efforts though. Yeah, good. So Stephen says asphalt is more a dark grey rather than black even in real life. I never paint anything black. I never ever paint anything black. My favourite colour in Vallejo is black grey. It's the darkest I go. Now I might put a black wash over the top, but I'm more likely to put a Starship Filth, which is also a dark grey. The only time I use black is panel lining, which I sometimes do use the black because the dark grey isn't quite dark enough. It's a really good point. Never ever paint anything black, ever, really. Monique, nothing is fully disposable until it's being used to death. Very true. So stating the obvious, putting paint on a toothbrush and dragging your thumbnail across it can produce a good random spray. Yes, I've done that for lichen or lichen, however you pronounce it, on a roof. But I just used a normal brush, I didn't use a toothbrush. And I used a cocktail stick, which I think some countries call toothpick, but cocktail stick's far more glamorous. And you just, flick past it and you get a spatter. And I was wanting lichen to go on the roof, so I was doing it in pale greens. Really worked well. But yeah, you can also do something like that, I think, with an airbrush blowing through something. But yeah, toothbrush. Trouble is, I have electric toothbrush. I do actually have some toothbrushes I use for cleaning somewhere. Digger's seen the spatter paint. Yes, I'm not alone. Thank you, Digger. I feel better now. And Reva70 says black grey Vallejo. Yes. If you don't own black grey Vallejo, go and get some if you can and just try it instead of black every time you're tempted to use black. And then if you want to put a black wash over the top, then it's really easy to do because you'll get more depth. If you start with black, you can't go any darker. You can't put a wash over it. You can't do anything with it because it's already the darkest tone you'll have. And stating the obvious says spatter painting walls in the bathroom is a cheap and quick finish. Yeah, I bet they have a machine that does it though. I don't think they just use the sponge on a drill, do they? Reva says my watercolour artist partner put me onto black grey with purple. Wasn't in the recesses, looks blacker. Oh, whoa, purple wash in the recesses looks blacker. Now that's interesting. I was looking at people painting Star Wars minis that are black, and I'm one of these people. If it's black, like I did a Vader and I painted him with black gloss, and then this was a bigger one, it was a 40mm Shatterpoint one. I painted him with black gloss, and then I painted his sort of black bits, which were greys, and then for his bodysuit and cloak I did them in a dark grey and put a wash over it. But his bodysuit, it was sort of shiny, but not matte and not gloss. So I left the helmet in gloss and I did those with a satin paint over it, and it still looked too shiny. So I did them with a matte paint over it. And it's amazing how putting a matte varnish, it was a matte varnish, sorry, not paint, a matte varnish over black made it look grey. Because I'm guessing matte varnishes actually have a white pigment in them to mattify. But yeah, definitely where I was going with that is most people painting Star Wars minis, they paint them in the black grey range, but a lot of people do a navy blue or something, so that they can, when they highlight it with a blue tone or something, just to get a slight tone to it that isn't just black and white. And it's really interesting to see what people do trying to paint black. I mean, I just paint it black because, hey, that's me. Right, so we've talked about, purple wash in the recesses. Thanks, Reva. We've talked a lot about sponges and brushes, which is what I use a lot. It's worth saying you need another set of brushes for applying things other than paint. So we've just been looking at paint here, but I use, and I did cover pigments briefly, but I also use tile grout a lot on my bases. And for like a scenery, I'll use tile grout, and then I use that tile grout as a pigment. And quite often to titivate it, I'm sure that's in my dictionary, to titivate it into place, I use a brush. Now I'm not using a good brush for that. I'm using one of my really broken tipped ones. If I'm adding I often use Targramp mixed as a paste. So I put white glue and water with it, and it becomes a sort of a ground paste you can use like mud or something like that. And if I'm doing that, I again apply it with the same brush. It's not one that I use for painting anymore. It's a really battered old brush with splayed bristles. If I'm using glue, white glue or something like that, I'll sometimes, if I'm doing dabs of white glue so I can put patches of static grass on, I will also use a brush for that. So you can start with painting, then you can drop your brushes down to you're not quite good enough to paint, but you might work for dry brushing or you might work for weathering. And then when they get too spattery for that, you may, I can use you on the scenery now. I could use you to do glue. That's kind of the same level as weathering often, but I can get you down. So definitely worth having different levels of brushes, and don't throw out your brushes ever until they're really knackered. There we go. So I'm not sure anything else that I can think of on brushes I should be imparting, apart from getting a good brush cleaner, which is this Masters brush cleaner I use, and washing them regularly and trying to get the paint out of the sort of barrel area, not to let it clog up there or dry up there, because once it does that, that is what starts splaying your bristles. Be careful about storage, and you can always wrap them in a bit of kitchen roll to keep the tips closer together on the bigger ones. So there we go. But for sponges, people have mentioned sponges here, and I've shown you a weathering sponge and the foam brushes. You can just have natural sponges, cosmetic sponges, bath sponges. They all have different textures, and you can rip them up to get smaller pieces. One thing that a lot of people do is they rip the sort of packing sponge that you get, the foam that's you might get around figures and things like that. And they rip that into little pieces and hold it with a tweezer and use it to dab it as a sort of fine but coarse on smaller models to add weathering. And I was doing that with that weathering sponge, but you can do it with even smaller pieces with a tweezer. And so it can be useful to get into gaps you can't get to with that big dabby sponge. So ripping up sponges is a really important technique. I've tried it, it does work. I think with the tweezer I used to drop it quite a bit, but it's still a useful way to do it. And yeah, it can work well. There's a lot of people laughing on chat now, but then Monique says she's still waking up. Well, we're all about to go to sleep at this end of the country, I think. Reva says, I use the waterproofing paint from behind showers to protect foam terrain. It's worked really well. And that's interesting. I mean, I just use a Mod Podge and acrylic paint mix that everybody uses, matte Mod Podge and acrylic paint, to protect foam. It works fine. I've just used plain white glue over some things. I was trying to paint waves, and I'd used foil to make the waves. I'd followed this video, and he used white glue, and it stuck to the foil, and then you can paint the white glue, PVA glue. You know, I sometimes think we come up with all these expensive ways to do things, and PVA is absolutely the cheapest way you can do. And people use it to seal walls before painting. But PVA is really, really just a great option as well. If you haven't got access to expensive paints or anything, and you need to seal your foam terrain, just shove a bunch of PVA on it. And Viva paints that on, obviously. And Monique says she uses the same thing. That's cool. Jaw21 says IPA to clean brushes. I would be worried about damaging the bristles too much with IPA, but then I use white spirit to clean oil brush paints, but white spirit seems oilier than IPA. I'm not sure when I would use IPA to clean. I guess you could, if the brush is really gone, then you could try it. David says use locking forceps instead of tweezers. I do own some, but actually they're so covered in paint because I used to use them for airbrushing before I moved to the clip things, that I generally don't use them much nowadays. Probably could do with getting some more. So Monique uses waterproof house paint. That's good to know. So Reva says it's tough and flexible, so it takes damage really well if it's used for like tournament terrain or shop terrain. That's a really good reason. And PVA also is quite flexible. So yeah, and Monique says house paint is cheaper than craft paint. All of my black edging, if I ever need a black edging, is black masonry paint. It was from a model railway. I bought a tub about this big, and I'm still just finishing off the first tub, and I have the spare already bought. It's B&Q masonry paint. So yeah, I do use it. But no, I tend to use PVA and acrylic, and I mix a colour, and this is a really important thing. I mix a colour that's the colour of the soil. So I use brown, raw umber actually, because it's my earth colour for most things. I use raw umber and rather than, I know a lot of people use black, but I use raw umber and Mod Podge, and that just means that if it shows through, it's not showing through as a bad colour. So you should always seal with something that gets rid of the pink and the blue and whatever your foam colour is, so that if you don't quite get all your scenery over it, you're hiding that. It's really useful. Hi Gustavo from Mexico, welcome. So there we go. Right, so we're quarter of an hour off the end, and I am just going to I'm going to play the pitch video again because I want to talk through a couple of things on this about how I painted this. Now I've just done the painting video, but I wanted to, let's just pause it there. I just wanted to show how you combine all these techniques. So on this piece here at the back, which is orange, I'm waving the mouse, but I'm guessing you probably can't see the mouse. No, you can't. Right. So on this piece at the back here, that's orange with the crosses on. I just want to run through the paintings there if you want to see it. I want to run through how I would cope with a piece of terrain like this size and applying paint to it. So I always start now with spray paints for terrain. I did a couple of coats of spray putty and then I spray painted a spray paint colour on because I want to get a good base coat on. And I would always recommend that the first thing you do on everything is a base coat around the mid-tone of what you want. So then you can put a darker coat on and you can put a lighter coat on. I did that. I sponged on light greys on, I actually sponged some oranges first, and then I sponged on light greys, which you can see on the orange. You can't really see it on the grey, but it is there just to add some variety. And then I used a black grey that I'd mixed up myself in Artist Acrylics. So it's a warm grey, because I prefer warm grey to any of the neutral greys, and then black, and then quite a bit of water in there. I brushed it on and then I wiped it off with a paper towel. So for all of that painting, the only time I mean I could have done that with a sponge brush, but I did it with a normal brush. The only time I actually used a proper brush was I used contrast paints from, well, speed paints from Army Painter to paint the brown crosses. And actually if you look down a bit you can see storage 2 just there in the writing. And I used the sponge brush, the flat sponge brushes, to dab that with a white to get that onto there. And all of the rest of these buildings are done with 90% the same techniques. And I find now I've been honing this technique for my Kickstarters. My next Kickstarter won't be done with this technique because it's pod racers and they're going to be small and done with scale model techniques. The scenery is maybe going to be done with this technique, but it's going to be Tatooine style scenery and not very much of it. I'm not really doing much terrain for that. But that's the one after this one, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But realistically, I hardly used a brush at all when painting these. And sometimes I think, I grab the brush because it's the easy thing, it's what I've been used to. But actually the majority of this is more about taking paint off with paper towels. And a small amount of detailing, but the majority of the work is just done with brush on, wipe off to get the smearing. So actually the paper towel has almost been the tool that I paint with, and the brush is just the applicator to put it on. And I could have used a sponge brush just as easily. Actually it would have been bigger and probably would have been better. So there, some of these things that we work with, everything here is painted that same way. You can see it on all of the details. There is a base coat that is the same grey on all of them, and then there's the dark grey and it's wiped off. And that's it. You know, they've all been sponged a little bit with the lighter grey to catch the edges. It's very subtle by the time you've got the black over it, the dark grey. And that's it. That's how I've painted almost everything recently. It's the same for most of my Kickstarters. You know, there's a lot of sponging, a lot more sponging than brushing ever. So the only time I'm really using my brushes at the moment in anger is on minis, which do need something like a brush. Reva says, in Australia, I'm constantly looking at Bunnings hardware store at their bad mix table in the paint section for $2 paints and mistake paints. Ooh, yeah. Thorn Hedge. Ever mixed oil with water? If you mix latex and oil paint and whip a lot out of it, it separates. You end up with beads of oil based in the latex. Okay, I can tell that you're not British because we have emulsion over here. So for those in the UK, emulsion equals latex paint. I haven't done it. And what do you do with it then? What do you do with your beads of oil based in the latex? It sounds to me like salad dressing, but I can't imagine that when you paint it works. So what do you do with that then, Thorn? Just kind of wondering. Norm says you can take your craft paints to the big box paint stores and they will custom mix to match. Great for huge terrain pieces. Yeah, I tend to spray paint the base coat on all of my huge terrain pieces. If I look here, this piece here is all Tamiya fine grey primer, apart from the yellow, which is Halford's filler primer. So yeah, there we go. So Thorn, you say further down, if you spray apply it, the latex goes on as normal and the oil produces splatters. If you use different colours, you can get your bathroom splatter effect. Ah, right. I am now following you. Well, that's interesting. Ah. As an incidental, when I was doing washes on huge amounts of my previous Kickstarter, the Corix Moon, and I was washing the whatever out of it, having done all the sponging, I spray painted the washes using just pump action spray bottles. So you can, because you want them to sit slightly, and by that point there was loads of sponging to break up the layer lines, and what I was doing was generally on factory areas, so yeah, it worked well. Don't feel that you have to even use a brush or a sponge to apply some things. You can just spray them on, as you're saying, and not necessarily with an airbrush. So Richard Hodgson says, whatever you clean with, finish with warm soapy water, rinse, let dry before storing. Yeah, I have a little pot by my sink where mine dry, and then they go to the storage when I next pick them up. Norm says, pod races, awesome. I hope so. I'm really looking forward to starting it. Got all the reference books now. Just need to get this Kickstarter done. Stuart says, looks like a Star Wars theme for a new movie. You should try it. Yeah, should be good. Monique says to Reva, that's where I get my hand paints from. You can buy half a litre test pot for $10, so way cheap. Yeah, I've actually think that you can get some really good paints in the B&Q and places like that in the UK, and Home Depot or whatever it is, Depot as I would say, but Americans say Depot. Where a brown would be brilliant. It's just great as a colour to go underneath. So Tim says, I mix enamel and water paints quite a bit when I'm doing slate rock faces. It seems to work. The technique is to slap it on quickly and work while wet, mixing the colours with the brush on the surface. I have just never thought of this technique. It's just blowing my mind. Wow. Reva says, most have a bad mix, so he's back on the DIY stores. Most have a bad mix paint shelf table where you can get $12, the 500ml packs for $2 to $3, but the colours are what they have. Stephen says, do you ever use Sharpies, Kathy? I've seen some do that. I was using them earlier on. I used them on the Tatooine ring style, the desert ring, to do all the lights. I tend to use the metallic ones, or I've used the black one. I did the black one for the wiring. So yeah, use them all the time. Really good. Or I've got the Gundam markers as well. And sometimes, and for chrome, Molotow chrome pen. So yeah, really do use them a lot. Stuart says, we have tartan paint here. It's a 70% oil paint and 30% water-based paint. If you're really good, you dip your brush in the tin and boom, you just paint straight on. Honestly, it's amazing. I think I can imagine if you did one set that way and then did a different colour going that way, you can get tartan. But you're not convincing me you can get checks out of paint. I'm sorry, just like, no. You'd have to do half that way and then half that way to get a tartan. Surely. Excellent. So, what time is it? 53. Tartan paint is awesome. I'm just, yeah. Okay, yeah. Will I Google it later, or will I just go, I'm not sure they're telling the truth there. Tartan paint. I'm sure it's a joke, Jaw21. Jaw21 saying, is that a joke? Timber Sir says the cheapest paint for terrain is school acrylic poster paint. Hobby shops have whatever's, I've got a big giant heart they like to put on the chat, have something having for £2 or less per litre. The only thing with poster paint is I don't believe it sets to a seal, because I think poster paint will re-wet with water. So it just depends if that's an issue with what you're doing. Yeah, but maybe it isn't. Maybe it depends on the brand. But yeah, whatever you're doing, just have a look. I think sometimes, especially when you're doing minis, you do want high quality paints. You do want to have high density, easily thinned, proper paints for doing minis. If you're doing scale models, again the same. If you're doing terrain and bigger stuff, I really feel that you want to have sort of cheaper paints. Model paints are just not gonna cut it for size. You're gonna spend a fortune and you don't need to. So I use mostly artist acrylics for that sort of thing. I get the pots that are this sort of size, and I'm sure I could do them cheaper with house paint, but I like the way acrylic paints work because I understand them, and I've got quite a lot of colours, and raw umber's always been my standard. So I have warm grey and raw umber. I have a black, I have a bright red for some reason, can't remember what I bought that for, and I have a sienna that I rarely use. But yeah, oh, so Timber says the acrylic ones, so he's talking about the acrylic school poster paints. That's good to know, because old-fashioned poster paints probably didn't. So Norm's saying, right, Google tartan paint and fluffing. Got it. Yeah, you may want to do that on some kind of private chat session, you know, private session. Right. So anyway, if anyone's got any questions, now's your time. You can get polka dot paint in Essex, says Timber. And Monique says that's where she gets the bigger pots from Bunnings. Yeah, because it is cheaper. You really don't want to be using model paints on terrain. And that's not to say, I mean, I just use all my speed paints to paint my terrain, but I'm using them for details, all except where I did the cargo colours. I'm generally using them for detail. So it's okay to use them. And the reason I used speed paints rather than normal paints was I'd put all that black on and I had it wiped off. So I already had an, if very crude and not that differentiated necessarily, but some kind of highlight and low light on there, and that allowed that to show through when I put the contrast paint on. So Reva thinks he loves Vallejo mahogany. He uses it too much. If it's more than my black grey, I'd be surprised. Yeah, some great colours out there. I really like the, there's a bluey grey I really like as well. You get your favourites. I know my favourites in lacquer paint, so I always use MS White, which is a slightly grey toned white. And I always use Tire Black, which is a slightly green black almost, which I really like. I use that for the edges. So Stuart is now saying the best colour is pink with yellow spots. Someone Google pink with yellow spots. I think you'll get Mr. Blobby if you Google pink with yellow spots. And if you weren't of a childhood when I was and you didn't know Mr. Blobby, then I'm really sorry. If you're in a different country, that will make no sense. But Google Mr. Blobby and you'll see what I mean. And you can Google that. It was a kids programme. I actually met one in real life doing some kind of adventure thing. So you can get transparent paint up here in the north called Northern O. So it's like water. Blobby. Right, so any last thoughts? We've got 3 minutes left. Anything else I need to impart? One, you know, don't think you need to have expensive brushes to get started. If that's something you choose to do as a treat to yourself later, well, I love tools and I treat myself all the time with stuff I don't need. Don't let anybody tell you you shouldn't buy expensive brushes. Just understand that you can start with cheap ones and move on up. If you're not sure what to use, just experiment. Try using different brushes, different sponges. Get a selection of sponges. I've got about 5 or 6 different types of sponge. I tend to stick to the weathering stick at the moment because it's easy to use. But you know, try a weathering stick like that. Try sponges in locking forceps tweezers. You know, have a go. Some people use other things for, like, you know, the foam brushes that for the eyeshadow that was mentioned earlier by Tamsin. You could use those. Some of them have got a fine texture on them, so you can use those perhaps for fine. As an aside, totally, I saw something on Instagram, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who did it. Oh, who was it? Anyway, it was somebody like 40k Warhammer painter. And he said, I don't really like using salt for weathering because it dissolves, which as I spray lacquers, I don't have a problem with. But he used sand for rust. And what you do is you put a layer of like water down or something to make it slightly sticky. And then you would sprinkle the salt on, or in his case, he sprinkled sand. And then you, when it's dry, you spray over it with sort of whatever your paint is. And then you can knock the paint off. If you use water, it will take the salt out, it will dissolve the salt, but you can also get the sand off. And underneath you've painted brown, on top you've done the sand and then or salt, and then you've painted the colour on top and the rust shows through. It's a really good way. I mean, you can end up with excessive rust that way if you're not careful. So if you want really heavily weathered rust, it's quite good. But there we go. I thought if salt doesn't work for you, try sand. So Stuart the Fish says Mr. Blobby is TV royalty, blobby blob blob. Ask the internet, says Reva. Monique says buy cheap brushes and replace them when needed. It's good advice. Norm says cheap is good. Nicking your wife's makeup brushes and sponges even better. I've got my own makeup brushes and sponges and I still go and use the proper artist ones. But as Timber says, blusher brush for applying weathering powders. Blusher brushes are great. Stephen's got to go. He's going to bed. Well, we're going now anyway. So I will say goodbye to people. Reva says airbrushes don't start cheap. Start at the $180 to $140 AU level. $20 to $40 airbrushes will turn you off airbrushing. That's true. We talked about airbrushing last time. But yeah, so we've talked a bit about that. Stuart says Norm checklist is pink with yellow sparks, tartan and fluffing. Okay. And stating the obvious is what thinners is good to revive Mr. Blobby paint. There we go. Anyway, guys, thank you for coming. I hope you found it useful. If you've got any questions or any suggestions for what you want to see next time, drop them in chat. Go check out my Kickstarter, please. Click the notify me kind of button at the moment. It goes live on Tuesday. Really excited for it. But thanks, guys. And thank you all for coming. I recognise so many of the names. You come every month and I really do appreciate it. Have a great modelling week and I will see you in a month's time for whatever I decide it will be about.